Good morning and welcome to the True Disciple broadcast. My name is Pastor Kevin Baird and I am your host. I am the lead pastor of Legacy Church here in Charleston, South Carolina, as well as the executive director of the South Carolina Pastors Alliance, a growing network of nearly 300 pastors in this state, and we are growing. And we've determined we're going to link up and network together in order to help use our influence to move along our concerns in the areas of faith, family, and freedom. I am so glad that you took the time to tune into us today and to listen, because our goal is to inspire you, educate you, challenge you, and most of all, we want to get you across the line of keeping your faith behind the four walls of your church or your home and activate you into a confidence of taking it and engaging your culture, because you have something to say and something to offer to our local region as well as our national concerns. I am so pleased to be able to have the second half of our interview with a good friend of mine, Bob Menges, who is, I believe, a resident constitutional expert. He, of course, would defer the praises that we would heap upon him, but he has done an incredible amount of study in this area and has helped local politicians, governmental leaders, has spoke into the lives of kids, shared at, I know, different venues of political activity and rallies. And so his expertise and his experience is vast, and I just appreciate him being with me again for this half hour on the True Disciple broadcast. Bob, welcome again to the studio.
Thank you, Kevin. Glad to be here with you today.
You know, last time we ended talking about sort of your background, the background of the Constitution and the Declaration and some of these documents, and I realize we've just scratched the surface on these things. I mean, it's amazing. You can hear just a few minutes of the story, and it just fires you up, and to imagine there are literally hours on this subject. But what I really wanted to do today was I wanted to leap behind just all the foundational things and talk about current issues and some current things that we're facing constitutionally in our nation. In fact, it dribbles all the way down to Columbia, South Carolina as well, and some of the things we are doing there. But I tell you what I'd like to get started with. Let's get started with my passion, and we're gonna jump into some other things here as well. But let's talk about the Roe decision, Roe v. Wade, in 1973, because for the last 41 plus years, America, I believe, has an indictment in the eyes of the Almighty, as we've exterminated nearly 50 to 60 million of our neighbors and fellow citizens. And it all sprung really out of the Pandora's box of Roe v. Wade. So maybe you have some history to that. I know you understand a lot. Tell us a little bit, and I'd like to hear your comments on this area.
Yes, and I would like to unpack it a little bit. Again, I think I mentioned last week that I've been teaching this particular course in constitutional law for 15 years, and one of the 30 cases that we dissect is Roe. And it's crucial for believers to understand the basics and the underpinnings of Roe. But if you'll permit me, I want to back up to set the stage for talking about Roe. We need to go back and understand, make sure that our listeners get a good grasp of the egregious nature of what happened in Roe. And there are even some liberals today that will tell you, there are some, not many, but there are some that will tell you that even though they agree or they like the outcome of Roe, they understand the way that it was arrived was so egregious, and they understand what happened, and that the way that we arrived at that. So I want to go back a little bit and look at Roe and unpack it a little bit. If you go back to where the founders, when they put this document together, we talked a little bit last week about the limiting nature of the Constitution and the idea that the Constitution is to limit the powers of those that would be put into leadership. What I like to refer to as the levers or the levers of power. When we elect somebody to federal office, we're literally handing them levers that operate the machine of our government. And it's crucial that they understand this. That's why it's so bad that we today elect people that don't have mastery, at least some expertise in this document. But Romans chapter 13 begins by telling us, let every person be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. And it goes on to speak a little bit more about that idea of governing authorities. And I would humbly submit that the vast majority today of Christians, and this is from years of speaking to believers, and I certainly am not the last source on this. I'm not a pastor, but I've studied this passage intently, and I'm convinced that it's taught erroneously today most of the time. And what I mean by that is that I ask my classes this, when I speak in different venues, I always like to begin by asking people, because I'm passionate about believers understanding this principle. Who is the governing authority in our country? And a lot of times hands will shoot up and people will say, well, it's the president or it's the Congress. Every once in a while, someone will say the judiciary, and I'm not quite sure where they're coming from with that one. But, and it's, if we were to go around the globe and say, okay, who is the governing authority in Saudi Arabia today? We would say that it's King Fahd. He's a king. The Bible tells us that no one has been placed there except by him. He is the governing authority. And we could jump around the world, and I don't want to take up time, but let's just jump right back to America. I want to submit to believers today, and then the listeners, is that the governing authority in our country is not a man. It's not a human. And the reason why is because our founders understood that principle of the depravity of man, and they were building off a legacy. They were building off a legacy of the reformers, of the Protestant Reformation, if you will. In other words, back in the mid-1600s, there was a guy by the name of Samuel Rutherford, one of the reformers. He wrote a book called Lex Rex. And Lex Rex is Latin for law is king. And people, when I say that, a lot of times people say, well, Bob, what's the big deal? What are you talking about that for? Because in that day, that was a radical concept. The prevailing philosophy or ideology of the day was Rex Lex, that king was law. And so it was a radical departure, but Rutherford found in the scriptures that there had to be a law higher than men. Now, as a Christian, you and I today, Pastor Baird, we know that our ultimate governing authority is the Word of God. But we don't live in a theocracy. Our founders set up a constitutional republic, and they set law over men. And so as I move into this discussion about Roe, it's crucial for us to understand that they set a document that put law above men. And they put it there for a reason, so that things could not be changed or shifted at the whims or the changing nature of men as we slip into depravity, as we are so prone to do as believers.
Yeah. And let me break in, because I want you, we may not be able to dwell here, but I want to emphasize, because you bring up a phenomenal point, because for years, because I respect the Word of God, I know you do too, and you read Romans 13, and I've heard this taught in numerous occasions, that even when you have wicked kings, I've heard it taught that somehow we're responsible to respond to wicked kings in a way that would cause us to do even wicked things. And I think your point needs to really sink in to some of our listeners, and that is, this is not Romans 13 is not necessarily personality driven. It is what is the governing authority, and that is the Constitution. And if we are asked to do something that violates that, then we have our Acts 5:29 moment where we can say, I must obey God rather than man. I must keep my fidelity to those things which have been established in an appropriate manner. This is such a crucial point for the church, because I think the church just sort of sails along this river of, well, it must be God's will that this personality, whoever it may be and at what levels, wicked, and we just have to endure it, so to speak.
Absolutely, and it's crucial that our founders instituted a system so that we would have a fixed point of reference. In other words, a fixed point of reference that always be there. And I submit to anybody really that if we were to follow our Constitution today as it was written, the Christian would never have a conflict with his conscience ever, because of what was set up to protect Christian liberties. And I know we can't linger here, but I want to drive this point home. And this happened at an event in 2010. As a matter of fact, I was at a rally, a Tea Party rally, if you will. And because my passion is the Constitution, I had just heard then candidate Jeff Duncan speak, and I hadn't met him, so I made a beeline to him across the plaza, and I said, hey, Mr. Duncan, my name is Bob Menges, Constitution's my thing. I said, can I ask you a quick question? I said, if you get elected, I said, where will your authority come from? And I could see the screen, the kind of shields go up. He probably thought I was trying to, one of his opponents, tricksters, trying to play something on him. I said, no. I said, I'm not anybody important. I just care about, understanding of the Constitution. I said, and so he looked at me and he looked at the crowd, and this is not to disparage Jeff. I think he's probably the finest congressman in our state today, finest constitutionalist. So I'll say that. But he looked at the crowd and he said, he laughs about this today because we've talked about this. He pointed at the crowd and he said, them. And I said, Jeff, I said, if everybody in your district calls you up and says they want you to do X, Y, and Z, and X, Y, and Z violates the Constitution, which is the rule of law that you're going to take an oath to, will you do it? And the light bulb went on. And the sense is that the understanding is that in our country, the governing authority is not a man. That doesn't mean that we don't submit to authorities. I have a boss that I work for that I have to submit to. I submit to my pastor, different authorities. But when it comes to the governing authority, that's why it's so egregious when a president, whether it be this one or prior presidents, flaunts the rule of law. That's why it's such an egregious act. But let's step on into Roe.
Yes. Well, and so let's do it. We've had 50 to 60 million abortions. Everybody's screaming, it's my constitutional right. I have a right to privacy. Keep your hands off my body. And you know the litany of catchphrases. Talk to us about why in the world this is just craziness.
Yeah, it is. In Roe was written by a guy by the name of, the majority decision was written by a guy by the name of Harry Blackmun. It was a 7-2 decision. And in Roe, the Chief Justice at that time was a guy by the name of Warren Burger. So everybody that signed on to the verbiage in that opinion. And I'm not going to go through and bore you with the details of Roe, although they're very, very compelling to see how horrible a decision it was because it was such a departure from the rule of law. Roe was based on a case that was a previous case called Griswold versus Connecticut. And I don't want to go into the details of that case, but something happened to that case that most people gave a wink and a nod to and didn't care about, but it opened a huge Pandora's box for what people refer to as the slippery slope. But in Roe, let me cut to the chase. Justice Blackmun said that there was nowhere to find this right for a woman to abort her unborn child, to terminate, to kill her unborn baby. To literally to murder her unborn child. I'm not trying to use inflammatory language, but that's what takes place. But Justice Blackmun said in Roe that he found in the penumbras of the Bill of Rights. Now, if you're hearing this for the first time, you might wonder, well, what is a penumbra? And when I teach my class, I actually teach what a penumbra is. A penumbra is an astrological term. It's the term that defines the shadow from an eclipse upon the earth. And I hope you're thinking about right now, Bob, what does that have to do with abortion? But it's crucial for the church to know what happened in that case. Penumbra means shadow. So what Justice Harry Blackmun said was he couldn't find the right in the Constitution. This is what activist judges do. They can't find permission in the rule of law. So what they do is they make it up out of thin air. And so this isn't just my opinion. This is written in Roe. He says that he found in the shadows of the Constitution the right for one person to kill an unborn child. And so if you can find that right in the penumbras, if you can find it in the shadows, then you can find anything. So this really goes to the heart of, are we following a rule of law or are we following a rule of men? And that's what's happened with our courts over the years. When I referred to last week, the last 80 to 100 years of stretching and pulling and twisting and perverting the Constitution, that's a perversion of the rule of law. 35 states in 1973 had laws banning the practice of abortion, of killing unborn children. And in one stroke of the pen, what those 7 justices did is they struck down the laws in 35 states. So in effect, they made law. Whereas the Constitution provides no right to do such a thing, that was left up to the states. I would go even further and say the Constitution provides the protection for life, so it is the job of the government to do that, whether it be the federal government or the state governments. And I know people will disagree with me on that, but I think it's clear. But that was the egregious, if I had to sum it up, that was the egregious nature of Roe, was the finding of rights in the shadows of the Constitution, what we just talked about being the rule of law.
Yeah. You're listening to the True Disciple broadcast here on WTMA 1250. I'm your host, Pastor Kevin Baird, and I'm visiting with Bob Menges, a teacher and studier of constitutional law, and it's just been an exceptional conversation. I want to continue with this Roe discussion because currently in our own state, there seems to be momentum with regards to personhood, basically declaring that unborn child a human being. And many pro-life legislators are having difficulty signing on board to something that I maintain is self-evident. And they're using sort of as the dodge, the constitutionality argument that, abortion's constitutional, that's the way it is, and despite the fact I'm pro-life, there's not really much we can do about it. We've had 41 years, and I really sense that both, demographically as a society, we know statistically we have now tipped over the 50% mark that we're a pro-life nation. I mean, there may be a couple minor exceptions, but generally now, statistically, we're told we're a pro-life nation, and yet we can't seem to get that in the mind of those who say they uphold the Constitution. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and you're referring to the bill that is also commonly referred to as the personhood bill. This is a bill that I'm going to guess probably the last 10 years, maybe longer, has been brought up in session every 2 years and literally goes nowhere. And we can talk about the nuances of Roe and being pro-life, and the personhood bill is the basic foundation. I had a conversation with my pastor, and I were discussing this. Both of us are amazed that is the basic bedrock issue for being pro-life. In other words, is the unborn a human? Does it have personhood? Is it created in the image of God, or is it not? And so anyone that's pro-life, I think that's really, we don't like to apply litmus tests, but to be honest with you, I think, and you said it well, I think you were implying the fact 41 years we've been quibbling over the little things that we win on this, or little advancements that we make to protect the unborn. And here we have an issue. Is the unborn a person? And South Carolina has the opportunity year after year after year to go on record as stating that we recognize that the unborn child is a living human being. And our state refuses to do that. Our leaders refuse to do that. And they do that based upon an argument that's made that, the Supreme Court is going to say it's unconstitutional. And all of us know that down through the years, I have several that I can pull right out of my pocket that I train my students to use. When somebody makes the argument that the Supreme Court said that, as if 9 robed men and women have the final say on something. And we've seen through history the horrendous decisions that have come from the court. Dred Scott is what I pull right out of my pocket, where the court basically said that people, because of the content of the melanin of their skin, the amount of darkness in their skin, whatever color that people want to call that, can be either human or not human. We knew that was an abhorrent decision. It came from Supreme Court justices. So for our leaders today to tell us that they can't do something because something can be struck down, it's time, and I know I'm preaching to the choir with my pastor friend here, that it's time for South Carolina to go on record and step out and make that claim. And there are even constitutional reasons to do that. And I know that there are much wiser people than me constitutionally. Know that I'm not a constitutional attorney. I have been studying it and looking at it for 15 years. But that doesn't mean that we can find things right there in the Roe decision. I had 4 or 5 of my students wrote brilliant letters to the senators recently when that bill was coming up for a hearing. Justice Blackmun, one of the things that he says in Roe is that it's not for them to decide, quote, the difficult decision of when life begins. So the implication was it wasn't for the courts, that it was for the legislature. It is the job of the legislature to determine those kinds of things. Now, as a Christian, I know that God determines those kinds of things. Yes. But the way that we codify civil law is for our legislatures. We have an orderly, lawful process that God has given us in our country with a legislature to create civil law. So it is the job of the legislature to codify those things, and the door is wide open in Roe to do that.
Absolutely, and there's such momentum in this regard. I know you've been to the State House already and have witnessed some things. I was there just a couple weeks ago, amazed at the turnout in a Senate hearing. They actually had to change the room they were meeting in order to accommodate all the people that showed up for the hearing on personhood. And you may have read this just the other day. I saw that there are, and I don't want to embellish the number, but I thought they said 30 states that had personhood bills working through their system somehow. And a national right to life leader said that he had never seen this kind of momentum in all his years with this sort of attention given to finally, because I think of technology, certainly constitutionality, the ability to see what's going on in a mother's womb, that we have reached the tipping point where we can no longer say that this is not a human being. That we no matter what you think, that's a human being. It's not another organ. It's not I'm not trying to be frivolous, a toaster. It's a human being that is alive. And does this human being have ability to give voice to its concerns and its future as well? And I know we have some other things to talk about, but let's wrap row, because I got to ask you about Hobby Lobby before we go.
Sure, yeah, and to quickly wrap that up, you're absolutely right. There's a great movement. Many states are pursuing things like that, the personhood type initiatives, because, and I frankly like it when I see the states get uppity, and that's an opportunity, and we see that happening in other areas, and I would just submit that if there was any area for the states to take a stand and to stand up and say, and let the Supreme Court strike it down. We're willing to fight in other areas that we know the Supreme Court is going to strike things down, but yet we're not willing to do it for the precious unborn children.
Yes, man, our time, we get to talking about this stuff and it just slips away. But let's go to Hobby Lobby, because it's on the front burner right now. It's the religious liberty issue right now of our generation. If abortion's in there too, but I'm just This revolves around abortion because the Christian owners of Hobby Lobby do not want to violate their conscience by providing abortifacients through a mandated insurance project that the government has implemented. And it's being debated right now. People seem optimistic that this will fall on the side of religious liberty, but we've seen where we think one thing and then we end up waking up a few months later with a hangover, looking at some of these decisions. But let's talk about religious liberty in our current era. What are some of your thoughts on this, Bob?
Yeah, we are continually under attack because of the onslaught. And you or I, during the break, before the tape, we started this today. We're talking about the idea that the secularists do not relent. They come back, they go for everything, and they don't give up. And this is an area where, frankly, it goes back to our discussion last week, that the church is asleep either just because of our unknowing, because of our ignorance. And I don't mean that in a nasty way. It's just the fact that we're unknowing. We haven't been taught this. We've been taught this. Our churches have been told to stay out of quote-unquote politics, the political arena. And I told this to just some folks last night. People, when I hear from Christians that tell me that they're not interested in politics, I like to ask them, do they understand that politics affects policy and policy affects people? So if we care about people, we must engage in politics. And so on to this issue of religious liberty. There's been an onslaught, and the church is completely in retreat. I would say we are completely running the other direction, away from the idea. And this is a God-given principle. This is a thing that, unlike no other nation in history, that our country was founded, and we talked about this last week, on these biblical principles to set up and enshrine, to protect liberty for the advancement of the gospel, not to force people to become believers. The founders understood that you couldn't force people into belief. They wanted to create a system of liberty. And I would submit that God has given us an incredible amount of liberty to be able to, for the purpose of advancing the gospel. So when the church is silent, it's really, to me, an abomination to what God has given us. So clearly, these religious liberty issues continue to march forward, and we're in retreat on them, and we're losing it.
Yeah, and of course, our listeners may not be aware, but a large Christian charity by the name of World Vision implemented a policy of hiring same-sex couples, and then they retreated on it after sort of the outcry that came to them. I'm only using that as a springboard to say that the only reason they backpedaled on this policy was because Christian leaders, pastors, ministries, the church arose and said, "Hey, if you're going to call yourself an evangelical Christian organization, then act like one. Begin to implement appropriate precept." But what that spoke to me is that if we decided as the church and leadership to arise, it's remarkable how things can turn around. And I respect Hobby Lobby. I wish somehow or some way that the church would arise and simply say, this is a Christian businessman. He has an ability to operate his business according to his values. And from everything I'm hearing is that he does supply contraceptives to his employees and did so before the Obamacare mandate. His problem is, I think, 4 out of 20 possible, birth control options, 4 of them are abortifacients. And he says, I'm just not going to do that. It violates my conscience. And all of a sudden, the government swoops in and says, you'll either do it or you'll lose your business. I mean, it's just a remarkable time we're living in.
It is, and if we could only understand how one peg coming loose leads to the rest of them coming loose. This goes all the way back to, and I know we're not discussing the Obamacare decision, but it really goes back to, I found it interesting. I was reading the transcripts from the Hobby Lobby oral arguments, and I found it interesting to see how quickly constitutionalism unravels from one thing to the next, because the government, first of all, constitutionally is limited. It's not even supposed to be in the business of directing private businesses what to do. But as we as the church says, turns away from that without interest in that, we tend to lose our freedoms. And this is a perfect example where we have an individual trying to stand up for his liberties, and the church ought to be standing alongside of him to do that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Hey, I've got about 3 minutes here, Bob. This half hour has gone so incredibly fast. I want people to know how they can get in contact with you if they want you to come speak to their group, their church, small groups, I'm sure community groups. I know you've been everywhere, and you do this wonderfully. Tell us how to get in contact with you.
Yeah, the best way to do that would be to go to my website. It's www.towardsarenewedmind. It comes from Romans 12:2, the principle of renewing our minds with the Scripture. But that's my passion, is to teach biblical worldview and the connection to government in the United States Constitution. So Towards a Renewed Mind, all one word, .com.
And I know recently, I want to mention again, you've been involved with the Convention of the States, Article 5 of the Constitution, which I'm with you on this, is the method, it appears, that is going to have to be implemented to reel the government, federal government, back to its original place. Hey, take 60 seconds, and I know it's your passion, but can people find out more about that at the same website? But let us know what you're doing in that area real quick.
Yeah, the Convention of States, www.conventionofstates.com. It's a national organization to urge and to empower the states to do what God has provided in Article 5 of the Constitution. And boy, if I can just blaze through this, in the summer of 1787, when the Constitution was being drafted, as the Articles of Confederation were being amended, there was a process put in to amend the Constitution. And all 27 of our amendments have come via the process that was put in there, whereby the Congress proposes amendments. But just before that convention ended, just 2 days before, a man by the name of George Mason stood up and he said, listen, and I'm ad-libbing for him here, but he said, listen, if the federal government, he called it national legislature back then because it hadn't stood up yet. Today we call it the Congress. He said, if the national legislature becomes oppressive and abusive, think about that for a moment, the people will have no recourse. And he suggested putting in a second mode, if you will, it's what we call it, a method, a process whereby the states, if 2/3 of the states would call for a convention, they could make amendments to the Constitution. So this effort is a process to call to put forth amendments, because the Constitution is not being interpreted by its original intent. It's been perverted. So this is a process to get the states to put forth amendments in a convention that would reset that system.
And they can contact you with
Yes.
all the information they need to get on board, because I know this may be the one lever that can take care of numerous things if we could get on board with this. Bob, I want to thank you for coming in and taking time out of your busy schedule to be with me. I appreciate it so much. I've learned so much just listening to you, and we're going to do this again here in the near future. And I am glad that you're listening today to this True Disciples broadcast here on WTMA 1250, and I want you to encourage to tell your friends what we're doing here every Sunday morning. You can get this program as well as others by going to our website at legacychurchsc.org, and we would be glad to give you all the links there so you can hit it and share it with other people. So as we conclude today, as always, I tell you, don't let it just be theory, let it be reality. Don't let it be just words, but you keep walking the walk, and you keep being that true disciple. This is Pastor Kevin Baird wishing you a great day today, and God bless.